María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Okay. Well,
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
I would that I hope you will bear with us as we might have some hitches, for this is the first time that we're doing an online
María Elena,
event.
your audio
Sorry
is
for
off.
the
María Elena.
broader audience. I would that I hope you will bear with us as we might have some technical differences. But first time that we're doing thank you
María
online.
Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Global Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with us discussion or some technical differences. But first time that we're doing thank you online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Global Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with us discussion or some technical the audience for being with us. I will first admit my introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. I will my introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is off. María Elena.
Members of Forum of Partners. I hope you will bear with discussion or some technical the panelists in this discussion. But aside introduction to online.
María Elena, your audio is
President of the Club de Madrid, let me just give you a very, very brief project and Boston project as far as the Club of Madrid is concerned, and Boston is one of our priority areas, and as far as the Club of Madrid is concerned, and Boston our main flagship or our flagship event of 2000 was a policy dialogue on digital transformation, artificial intelligence, and democratic development. The work that we're going to be doing on multilateralism and global going on artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and democracy fit into this broader picture of a reinvigorated multilateral system. Our policy discussions will be addressing different sub-themes or sub-topics that have an effect and synergies and a relationship with the multilateral system, including that between digital technologies and artificial intelligence, and of course democracy, where natural of the social contract, which is something or a topic that the Boston Global Forum has been focusing on particularly, that is that linkage between artificial intelligence and the social contract. Well, in the broader picture, this is also central, and this we've to join forces to have the discussion, bringing our members and their political experience together with that of experts that are addressing these issues as we look at a way forward and a way of addressing the challenges. Obviously, today we're all subsumed in discussions, both health discussions on the health challenges that we are facing because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that affects how that is affecting and is being addressed by our political system, by our multilateral system, and by our policies. And so this is inevitably going to come into our discussions today and as we move forward. But we hope that this first online roundtable will feed, as we were saying, into a policy lab that will be taking place in September, again, together with the Boston Global Forum and in collaboration with them, and into the discussions that will be feeding into the discussions that we will be continuing throughout this year and into our annual policy dialogue on multilateralism that delivers, that will be taking place in October. And that will include a discussion on digitalization as a key aspect for the future of multilateralism. So with this, I'd like to pass the floor, the space, this virtual space, to my friend and colleague Tuan from Boston, Executive Director of the Boston Global Forum, so that we can continue the discussion. Thank you all very, very much, and let's hope for as meaningful a discussion as we can have today. Thank you.
Club de Madrid, we are very honored to collaborate with Club de Madrid to organize this special event and very timely topics. And very glad to see very, very fruitful and helpful and great. Club de Madrid is a great partner of Boston Global Forum, and we are highly respect members and achievement Club de Madrid have succeeded, and we believe we have for a long time partnership and relationship. And today we are very honored to introduce our key leaders, distinguished thinkers of Boston Global Forum and Boston area. That is a facilitators and panelists today. And they are very key person in build and contract, develop the new social contract in AIH, the social contract 2020. We will discuss today also. And also they are co-founder and mentor of AI Society Innovation Network. We are very honored to introduce Professor David Silberway. He is a facilitator. He is a Harvard Medical School. Professor Alex Penland is founding faculty director of MIT Connection Science. Very partnership, a very important partnership with partner with Boston Global Forum also. Professor Bradley Chukri is the Political Science Department of MIT. Professor Tom Patterson, co-founder of Boston Global Forum and Harvard Kennedy School. We are very honored to introduce our distinguished thinkers and professors here today to contribute for our roundtable. And also, we are honored to thank Chamber Khánh Hòa support for us for Boston Global Forum and Club de Madrid for this year event. Thank you so much. And for members of Club de Madrid, we believe we have great roundtable. This is a very important event of Boston Global Forum, as we see us is a part of AIWS Summit 2020. Thank you. Now, Professor David Sinvoy. Yes.
Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Maria Elena. And I think all of us are really excited. The topic of the day with our distinguished colleagues couldn't be more pressing, couldn't be more timely, especially in this day and age of COVID-19. I'm, among other things, a physician, and what's happening in transforming our world as we speak in all of our countries is something that has pushed us into an age of technology even more, has brought out even more social underlying issues and challenges, and provides really a very timely backdrop for today's discussion, which in a broader sense has to do with AI, with the digital world, and with the ways in which we can assure that with all the technical developments that we keep up on the policy side and the ethics side so that we can serve humanity with these tools rather than the other way around. If we think of big data, the reams of data that are being collected on all of us all the time, let alone the questions now around tracking of the virus and contacts that people have interpersonally and socially, all of these things raise big issues. You then add artificial intelligence, machine learning, ability to aggregate and to analyze and identify patterns in these data, and the potential uses of that, which are protean and which are transforming business, social media, everything really. But in that regard, again, the laws, the policies have not kept up. So the discussion today really will focus on how, in a multilateral world where power centers, government, big tech, which is now international and which holds the keys in a way to a lot of the technology and the data, as well as the private sector, civil society, academia. How do we all think together around these things? We're going to be talking about a social contract or the concept of a social contract. It's worth pointing out that Telefonica came out with a Bill of Rights, a digital New Deal that is comprehensive as well. And so this will be ripe for discussion. What are the different approaches? How do we work globally and in a concerted fashion to serve the people we serve? So with that as an introduction, I'd like to start the questions to the panelists. Each panelist initially will have 5 minutes. And while I will ask a question, in a way, I want to hear, and especially with our Prime Minister and President, their thoughts on the matters. So we're going to start with the academics, if you will, from Harvard and MIT, and start with Sandy or Alex Petland, Professor Petland. And Professor Petland, the issues that you are expert in around privacy and so forth are, as was said, really primary here. There's centralized and decentralized approaches, for instance, to tracking COVID or any epidemic or pandemic, where either the government or some central entity curates and houses and has control over the data, versus a Bluetooth encrypted Apple, Google, other tech sort of tracking that by design, if you will, as opposed to by trust or hopefully trust. How do you and how should we think about this in terms of balancing the needs and rights of privacy and personal individuals versus the collective good, and also protecting against what we're seeing, unfortunately, in some parts of the world, government surveillance and use of these sort of techniques in a less salutary mode.
Thank you. So a lot of the discussion, I think, presents this as a false choice and misses the things to really worry about. So today, before the digital, when you get a disease, you go to the hospital, they interview you. That's called contact tracing, about who else you might have infected. It's a standard process. That data is held by the hospital, and the public health authorities may contact the person. This is the way that it's been for most of a century, most places in the world. I'm not worried about, now as we have technology, there's a couple things we can do better. For instance, with COVID-19, you have to remember back a week or 2 weeks who you interacted with. Nobody can do that when they're sick and in the hospital. And so your phones actually know where you were. That's your data, only you can see it, but you can then share that with the interviewer in the hospital. And that's your personal choice. However, that choice is forced also because the data you give away to the hospital there will protect somebody else's life. So there is not just your privacy concerned here, it's the lives of other people and the public good. The focus on databases is really, I think, the most interesting thing. The Bluetooth things that Apple and Google have done, this is just like, they're conduits for carrying data. They are honestly not going to be able to look at the data. The thing that scares me is what happens to the data when it gets there. Where does it go? So people talk about a statewide or national database, and that's the stuff of nightmares. Today, that data is held by the hospital or the people who test your antibodies. So it's local, it's distributed, it's in the hand of health authorities. And that's as it should be. And until we sort of understand much more about how we can sense contact, sense disease, which may take decades, seriously, right? It should remain human-centric in the hands of the medical personnel that are doing things. However, there is a really key issue which the West has ignored, and that is the thing that makes contact tracing work in the East and historically is the ability for the authorities to go someone who may have been infected and quarantine them. If you can't quarantine them, contact tracing is not powerful enough, according to our simulations, to stop the disease. So what that means is if I have lunch with you and 2 days later I get sick, the authorities have the right to be able to lock you up away from your family for 2 weeks. But clearly, that's not something that Western society lightly or is familiar with doing. But yet the simulations, the data that we've been able to look at, suggest that you can't stop this pandemic without being able to do that for around half of the people, to be able to actually enforce the quarantine. So there's the issue of public good versus private good. This whole thing, though, is actually, there's a larger issue which has to do with the social contract. In the Sustainable Development Goals, there is the right to digital identity. And this is an example of digital identity, just like your income, just like your passport, your health status is part of your identity. And we have, in the West, ignored this idea of having a coherent policy about digital data about a person, their digital identity. And that needs to be put in place. Some countries are moving forward on this faster. Estonia, of course, right? India has a version which has some problems. But in general, this is an example of that. And the danger is always national databases, big brother, versus local holding and local authorities. And I think that's really the issue, is don't see this as an isolated thing. See this as an example of digital identity, and how are we going to sort out the ownership, the public good, the rights of government to use it, and how are we going to control the uses of this data. And I think that one last thing is that we can look at places where we've already sorted this out. So for instance, today, money is all digital, even though we have some paper things left. We have ways of transporting that digital data called MasterCard or wire transfers. We have local banks that hold the data. We have credit cards for using the data. And it's pretty good in lots of ways. The banks sometimes sell data they shouldn't. And we have an analogous thing in medical data, but it's all paper-based at this point. And so there are things we begin doing that are with digital versions of that medical data and with money. And we just need to have a much more coherent view about who owns the data, who controls it, how is it transported, how do we audit how it's used. So that's my 5 minutes.
Alex, thank you so very much. And that really helps to map out some of the really important elements of the landscape. Professor Chowkri, Nazli, I'd like to engage you in discussion now, or ask you to speak to these issues through the lens of a social contract, or potentially a new social contract. What is that concept? How is it relevant? How can it be applied, or should it be applied in the age of big data and AI and COVID? You're on mute.
I don't see it on my screen.
You're good.
Okay. Okay. All right. So just to start with the obvious, we're living really in a global community that has an unprecedented common predicament, which goes without saying, the pandemic. But at the same time, convergence of many, many changes, and you've already mentioned several of them, including the AI, concern about big data, etc. I think we're at the point where rethinking best practices we've had and extending those best practices. We've had some experience with sustainable development. We've had some pragmatic underground transformations that we've seen. And then we also know that about 20 countries have announced formal strategies for the management and adapting to change related to AI. So basically, we're not moving into a completely new territory, but we're thinking about how to consolidate the common wisdom and put down some solid foundations for new standards in the international system. As you know, in the West, we trace the word social contract back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but every society, everywhere, has had and continues to have a form of consensus-based cohesion function. So the idea of social contract 2020 is really to consolidate and to lay down the foundation for a multi-stakeholder, not a country-specific or society-specific or problem-specific social contract, but for a set of principles that converge and build on consensus. The interesting thing about the notion of social contract is that it is predicated on consensus building. There is no contract if the participants don't want to sign a contract. That's elementary. And there's no social contract if the military comes in and imposes one. That's elementary too. So the role of and the function of multi-stakeholderism, forgive the English, it's not a very good statement, in societies that are becoming more AI intensive, directly or indirectly, is fundamental because it is an anchor to consensus building, because it recognizes that different stakeholders are legitimate and there is no value-based hierarchy among the stakeholders. There may be a hierarchy in implementation, in operation, in pragmatism, but as to the value of the stakeholder, they are all equal. That means government, business, industry, private sector, voluntary organizations, students, even professors, and the like, At this point, I think we are able to converge. I would presume to say that we can converge on a set of principles. We can converge on a set of responsibilities. You shall and you shall not. The conversion itself may be stretched and it requires more consensus building. But when we think about the social contract for 2020, we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from a very solid background, not necessarily of success, but not of total success, but of considerable success in the experience that we have had since the sustainable development, since the Rio meeting. So the challenge now is how best to articulate the commitments to and the responsibilities of individuals, of citizens, of government, especially governments, of business. Let me remind you of the obvious, and this is much of our AI technologies. In fact, I would say all of our AI capabilities come from the private sector, supported by funds from the government, clearly, but the private sector is a core element. There are marginal groups in societies that have been pushed out, if you wish, not by intent, but by facts. And here I would say that almost every country has homelessness as an issue, homeless community, and now we see it much more so because of the coronavirus. But we've never really thought of the homeless community as individuals, as a stakeholder, and they are fundamental stakeholders. So where does this bring us to? I think it brings us to the notion of, if it is possible, as I believe it is, and as I believe it can become, to frame a social contract, again, consensus, I think, is the most important element, to provide a function of connectivity. Now, let me give you an analogy, not a very good one, but an analogy. We know that the TCP's IP is the platform for communication among internet users. If that goes to zero, we're in trouble. And so the notion is that we should consider the social contract 2020 as a platform of connection. The connection are not wires, but the principles, and they are anchored in the belief that, like it or not, we are all in the same boat together. And at this point in time, this becomes very, very, very clear. Now, my last point has to do with, there's no need for me to go over the principles and the responsibilities, etc. We can deal with this some other time. But there are two other things that we ought to bring up. One is the development or the necessity of a new kind of function or role that could help move the process along. And the process, I mean consensus building. The first has to do with AI assistance. I must say, when I was first, when this was first framed, I thought to myself, now, come on, what is this about? But I've come to the conclusion that the combination of human-machine interactions and functionalities can really help support the AI users and assist them to serve broader society, to show them that how to engage with various power centers as facilitators. And we all know that in many areas of advanced computing or advanced communication technologies, many of us are mainly illiterate, so the facilitators become very important. Now, my last point has to do with what next? What happens next? What happens next in terms of design as well as in terms of implementation, in terms of operation, is having to think about how do we implement. Suppose there is a consensus. Suppose everybody agrees that social contract 2020, framed roughly as I've outlined, does make sense. When do we think about implementation? What are the anchors of the implementation? What are the markers of the implementation? To articulate these clearly, but there are one or two that are evident. One is a code of ethics. Another is really a system to monitor. It's a little bit dicey here because monitoring is a snooping, a form of snooping, but monitoring the discharge of responsibilities. That yes, indeed, responsibilities are being discharged. And then there are a set of ideas about a new AI UN system, network, whatever, to support and augment what we now have. And then the final point, the very, very last point, is exploring the possibility of building, and I'm being very, very cautious here, although I do believe it can be done quite effectively, a transatlantic alliance for beginning to think about digital governance as a mechanism to help us articulate better and enforce and implement the social contract. Bottom line is build cohesion and then build on cohesion. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Nasli, Professor Chow, for the overview of those important issues around social contract that's cohesion-based and consensus building. Professor Patterson, Tom, tell us about the concept of smart democracy and what it is, how it might be relevant then in this context to advance the principles and practices that have been articulated and to provide the sort of protections that have been described as well.
Oh, thanks, David. Leslie highlighted many of the points that I would make on that particular issue. I would say just this about the social contract, and it's about the difficulty of thinking about a social contract for the digital age. We have the normal problems of thinking about a social contract. What are the fundamental rights of the individual? What are government's obligations, duties to promote, protect these rights? But you add complexity, I think, when you think about a social contract in the digital age. The complexity of non-state actors like Facebook and Google that are potential threats to these rights. The difficulty of kind of thinking about this globally, transnationally. The traditional solution to a social contract and the way you build out kind of democracy, you strengthen democracy, is through a constitution enacted by a sovereign state. That doesn't quite fit the situation that we face. So I think we need to really think hard about what the social contract is going to look like. It's going to take a lot of leadership, and the kind of leadership I think that the Boston Global Forum and Club de Madrid can provide. And we're going to spend a lot of time at our conference in September talking about this. So actually I would like to take some of this time as a political scientist to talk about what I see are some of the threats that are created to rights by this health emergency. Two of them, to me, involve citizens. One of these threats is that citizens will come to accept these emergency measures as somehow normal. And the longer this crisis goes on, the more likely they are to think in those terms. And then, in fact, we might be in a new normal where there is less concern about individual rights. A second risk, I think, that relates to citizens is that they will come to prefer surveillance because of the perception that it offers safety. Of course, this is the classic trade-off between freedom and security. And we've seen that before, at least in the United States. It was there in the early years of the Cold War, and we saw it after 9/11, where Americans were quite willing to let government intrude on some of their rights on the assumption that it would give them greater security. Two risks in terms of government. One is that governments will use this health emergency to pass laws, enact regulations that would be politically unacceptable in normal times. And again, we've seen that after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the US Congress passed a law that broadened the government's surveillance powers, including the right to dig into individuals' private medical records. I think a second threat, risk surrounding government that's could come out of this is that the surveillance that they're doing could be now done in secrecy. And again, we saw that after 9/11 in the United States, when our National Security Agency, for about 10 years, without any legal authorization, collected data on individual phone calls and emails. Tens of millions of Americans were monitored in that way. And then finally, I think there are two risks that relate to firms. And one is that the need for surveillance in this period, I think, will become part of their argument about why they should not be governed by strict privacy laws. And we're already seeing that in California. California has a privacy law that applies to firms that's about to come online, and big tech and other companies are lobbying heavily the government there to rescind that law, or at least modify it or delay it. And they're using this particular health emergency as a basis for that plea. And the second is that the surveillance tools that are being developed in the context of the health emergency could be repurposed afterward for less worthy purposes. And in this way, I'm kind of less worried about the Facebooks and the Googles of the world than the dozens of firms that have developed, smaller firms, that have developed these various apps of surveillance that are useful tools in this particular period. But I wonder, I don't think they're going to shelf them after it's over. And I think these are very substantial and plausible risks. And I think there's some things that we need to insist on to minimize the risks that are inherent in them. One is that any measures that are taken during this period should be proportionate to the threat. The second is that any measures taken during this period should be instituted with full transparency. We need to know what governments are doing. We need to know what firms are doing. And then we must insist that these measures be rescinded or relaxed once we begin to come out of this crisis. And then finally, I think, and this to me is very important, we need to ensure that there's a fair distribution of the benefits and the burdens of what we're doing. And if you look at the United States right now, it's not fair. That our vulnerable and disadvantaged communities are bearing an unfair share of the burdens, prisoners, Black Americans, and the like. So I think there are major risks that attend the health emergency that are threats to rights, and that there are some things that we can do to try to keep them at a minimum, and afterward to ensure that they don't rebound in ways that makes things worse on that front. Thanks, David.
That was really terrific as well. And I think now between our three professors, we have a landscape that's been fleshed out a bit in a number of the issues. And I think we're eager to hear from our government leaders who are also academics and highly experienced in these technical matters to put some perspective. So President Turk, I would like to ask you to help us see this through the lens then of government. We see the tremendous needs, the dangers, the possibilities. How can we get it right? How can we get it right in a multilateral world where there are different systems? How can we work together? What are some of the legal frameworks? And how can governments work on the narratives, the frameworks, the use of data, the trust and global standards and so forth to be able to put this all together in a way that will advance humanity and not further the dangers?
Thank you. Well, of course, these are questions worthy of a long discussion today and further discussions in September and later. Maybe I should start by saying that as president of Club de Madrid, I'm very happy that we have this conversation today, because I think this will allow us to develop a set of questions which require an in-depth discussion in the future. Obviously, we are confronted with a changing world, with a changing reality, and there are many phenomena which are receiving very superficial, immediate answers. And there are traditional or old challenges which we know. Professor Peterson just spoke about the whole trade-off between freedom and security, a very old one, and of course one which is put in a very serious context with the COVID pandemic and everything that's happening around that. Now, I would like to start by kind of a memoir. You see, in 1980s, I was working as a human rights expert and in the United Nations, in various other places. And of course, at that time, we were discussing the whole range of human rights issues. Now, the right to privacy obviously has always been there and was discussed. But the perception at that time was that that's really not a very serious matter, because what was serious were like freedom of expression, that was seen as very serious. The right fair trial was seen as something very serious. Protection of life and physical integrity of prisoners was seen as something very serious. Limiting the government's possibilities to declare states of emergency, all that was seen as very serious, but privacy was not. Now the world has moved much further, and today I think we live in a better situation than back in 1980s. But then again, we understand the centrality of the problem of protection of privacy much better, and I think that we meaning many of us, are seriously concerned. Really seriously concerned. Now, privacy is not about protection of family secrets. It's not about hiding. It's about something fundamental. It's about human agency. It's about protection of human person to be able to function in society as a human person. And technology can be a very real, very serious threat to that. So the first requirement of this whole discussion would be to put the questions of the right to privacy at the center and figure out protection that is adequate. Now, of course, this is extremely difficult and will depend differently from different countries, different cultures, different legal systems, everything, but it remains central. Now, coming quickly to the current discussions in the COVID pandemic. You see, I belong to those people who are very skeptical about reliability and effectiveness of technology, not to speak about privacy element. When I hear all this stuff, how technology can ensure kind of control over spreading of the virus, I'm very skeptical. I don't think that it's doable. And we can see in Singapore, for example, how great technology in a country which doesn't care too much about privacy and protection of individual. A second wave happened as a result of spreading of disease among the migrant workers who were by definition not protected. So this brings me to Professor Shukri's discussion of vulnerable groups, which are often neglected in these discussions. So in addition to that, obviously, in the COVID world, we have the problem of surveillance and problem of gratuitous use of data via different channels. And Professor Peterson spoke about that, so I don't think I have to elaborate on this any further. One aspect which was not discussed so far, but I think is important, is the question of companies, big companies in particular, and the tendency of seeing profit first and most important kind of need. Monetization of data is relevant here. Because both large companies and many small companies, as we heard from Professor Peterson, will be interested in making money. They are not terribly interested in kind of controlling individuals for some political purpose, but simply for making money. Now, I have read a few books about Cambridge Analytica, and the more I read about that stuff, the more I am shocked by the sheer triviality of thinking behind all this mischief that has been, of course, uncovered later. So we have to look at that as well. Now, let me conclude by referring to two questions which are really important for policymakers. At the national level, how does the state deal with prevention and punishment of gratuitous, which can be exercised either by state agencies or by private actors? Gratuitous surveillance should be banned. There should be real bans and real criminalization. Criminal legislation which would make this sort of activity serious offense. I don't know where these things are in United States and in different states of United States, but I think given the brilliance and intensity of legal discussions in United States, it would be very good to look into that. And my hypothesis here would be that the approach to take is through making certain activities clearly criminal, punish them, and make those punishments visible. Now, this is brutal, but sometimes brutality is necessary for protection of democracy and agency. My second suggestion here is to think about the global developments really with great care. Now, obviously, we shall have, as Professor Portland said, of course, a lot to discuss about COVID-19 and various techniques, and WHO, which will have its annual assembly in a few days, will probably start a discussion about that. That's one aspect. But then there is also a question of a problem which has been in the making for the last 2 decades or so, and that is fragmentation of cyberspace. UN was not allowed to play any real role in managing internet or protecting the global nature of cyberspace, for reasons which can be discussed and which are very easily understood. And we are now in a world where a new Cold War is a possibility between the United States and China. This will deepen the fragmentation enormously and paralyze international communication tremendously. We already see marginalization of the United Nations. We already see the limits to what genuine consensus could be reached at the global level, I don't see that as a very strong possibility at this time at all. And when we think about a social contract which would necessarily have to deal with a kind of a global approach, we have to be very careful. I was involved in the past, and this is my last point and my last memoir, with the Community of Democracies, which was very fashionable in the years between 2000, the first decade of the century, basically. And it was, it was started with enthusiasm and optimism, but we have very soon discovered that states may be very democratic, but they are also very much aware of their national interests also. So even among the democratic, kind of genuinely democratic states, it was hard to achieve anything like consensus. So I believe that these problems we'll have now too, and I think that this requires very careful thinking. Now, I would invite to Boston somebody from the United Nations structure, people who are currently dealing with all these discussions. I'm not familiar with all the details, and I cannot measure the level of problem as it exists today. But the problem is known. It has been there for a long time, and will have to be taken into account as we proceed with our discussion. So these are my thoughts at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, President. And really helpful to be able to get that perspective. And those concerns are very real. And to get a sense of the sweep of time, too, in terms of the politics, internationally and nationally, as these issues have evolved. So thank you. And now, Prime Minister Aho, it would be wonderful to hear from you as well in terms of your broad perspective and experience, perhaps particularly around the issues of how governments and technology companies can or should work together to address these challenges, and also how one deals with the issue of that, in a way, President Turk just alluded to. You have democratic countries that differ, and also we have now undemocratic countries and even authoritarian regimes that are seem to be multiplying and can use a crisis to dig in even further. So how does one try to bring people together or bridge, or can we do this?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to join this very interesting discussion. My first comment is about the crisis. If you look back, economic or any kind of crisis, global crisis or substantial crisis, there are two things. For the first, you never come back to the old. There is always a new normal coming after the crisis. And secondly, this new normal is based on one basic fact. Crisis is strengthening existing tendencies, both when thinking positive side and negative side. Always crisis leads to a situation where these trends will be strengthened. I will take positive examples. They are easier to be recognized. Finland is very famous that we have a good education system, and we have been very proud to present that idea to the outside world. I have tried to ask several times Finnish educational authorities, are you sure that we have been doing everything that we can to digitalize education? Because that means a great opportunity to get personalized education, not to compare students to others, but to be able to identify what kind of progress individual students or pupils are able to get. And they have always said, oh, everything is done. We are doing fine, extremely fine. Don't worry about that. Now, after this crisis, we had to start using digital tools at schools. And all have recognized We were not prepared for that. And when we started to do that, because we didn't have any alternative, everything happened very fast. Changes that normally had taken several years have been able to be executed within few weeks, and they will never go back. Good example from company side as well. I just discussed with the CEO of the biggest or second biggest forest industry company in the world, saying that they had a meeting for customers and customers in China, 5,000 altogether, and they had one single online meeting with them. And the CEO said, "We have never understood how efficient these technological tools are. We are never going to go back to the previous system." Or if you look at remote working, we have said that we have started, we have experienced. The fact is that within these few weeks, we have learned a lot. These tools have been developed and they are getting better and better every day. We are never going to go back to the old. So these are the first comments. So technology is going to change the world, and technology is going to be changed because of the world is changing. So there is interaction between societal, economic aspects and technological aspects. Secondly, when thinking technology, I think technology is not good or bad. We can absorb technologies better or worse. We can create better systems if we are capable to do that. Technology is providing opportunities for that. And I think the critical thing now is when we think about the new social contract, technology plays a critical role in that, much more important than ever before. But we have to understand that it's ecosystem. It's not a question of absorbing technology into the old systems, or from technology perspective, it's not a question of pushing technologies into the existing systems. But the idea is how both will be changed. Both societies and technological tools will be changed simultaneously. And we have a couple of good examples how governments and companies have been working together. The United States was leading mobile technology development until 1980s. But then the European Union institutions, national governments, but big companies as well, research institutions, came together in Copenhagen, and they adopted CSM standard. And that standard was taken as pan-European standard. And every company, every government started to apply this standard and to make their efforts according to that standard. And within few years, 6-7 years later, that was a global standard and winning one. I think there is a difference between the US and Europe in that respect. US is believing that technologies, when competing with each others, will decide what kind of technology is going to be the winning one. In Europe, we believe that governments can play some role. I'm in favor of this European approach. It's a bit slower than American method, maybe, but it's going to guarantee that we can balance between all these aspects. Finally, I think everything depends on this crisis, and the critical thing is how long it takes to get rid of this. If it's short one, I don't think that we are going to see major changes to take place. The world is not going to be changed in a dramatic way. But if this is a longer period of time, and I'm sorry to say, but I'm quite confident that this is going to take much longer than what we expected today. It will have dramatic consequences, and I'm optimistic that this is like a global war. After the Second World War, governments have to come together and to start creating a new global system. And I think that quite soon we are going to recognize that if we want to get rid of this disease, we have to work together. we have to have some kind of global concerted effort against this virus. But also recovery will require global collaboration. And I think that is a good opportunity for us to take an initiative and try to influence. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Aho. How wonderful that each of our 5 speakers has addressed something different and yet convergent and complementary. And I think it sets the stage now for a brief discussion that we can all have together before going to questions and answers around these issues. And some of the things that stand out to me are this notion of catalyst, crisis as catalyst, and the need for change anyway, and the importance of our taking a stand and working together to shape a better future coming out of this. The issue, we use the word privacy a lot and a lot of other words. We haven't used the word freedom, and yet we're using surveillance and so forth. And this can curtail freedom, the issue of control of people, as well as the issue of identity and ownership of data. And then this issue of, there's not only the democratic states, but the undemocratic ones. There's not only the good actors, but the bad actors. How do you, we haven't touched upon in our other forum, we talked about cybersecurity. It only takes a few nefarious actors, unfortunately, some of whom are state actors, let alone rogue actors, to really disrupt things. And so it'd be great to hear, people's sense of how vulnerable we are and what sort of protections we need to build in as we go to this next step of this ecosystem. So those are just a smattering of ideas to throw out there for the 5 of you, but I'd love for you to discuss them or anything else that comes to mind, or ask each other questions so that we can now have a dialogue. Alex?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think we need to do is look to other domains for this sort of international cooperation. And it's worth noting that commerce, while it's different in every country, has to be able to interoperate to be able to be useful to anybody. And so there is some sort of ground there for standards of interacting, standards of fraud, standards of identity. And I would suggest that that's an important place to begin, and particularly because of this problem of cyber attacks, rogue actors. We have all of that in the financial area and in other similar related areas. And we need the same sort of thing around data. Currently, we don't have that. Do we know that the data is the correct data? Do we know how it can be used, etc.? Well, we know those things about money. We know those things about land. We know them about certain other sorts of things. And we need to build those sorts of structures. Nasli talked a little bit about AI assistance. In the domain of money, we have created banks and financial advisors and mutual funds to help us deal with as individuals, help with the complexity. We need the same type of thing around data and AI.
Yeah. Nasli.
Of cyberspace. This is really a very, very serious issue. And I'm not sure that fragmentation is the right word or not, but the increasing evidence of state interference in network flows and increasing importance of understanding where the control points are. There are multiple types of control points. Some are physical and some are notional, and some have to do with the protocol systems. And my favorite is the BGP protocol. So the point here is that much of the ecology of the cyber domain that makes, with the internet at its core, that makes it a a domain, a communication domain, we really have not looked carefully enough at various properties and various points of who can control what, where, and why. And finally, we also haven't looked at the physicality, the physical properties of that system. In a different context, we've been looking at China and then network flows and identified empirically that 2 points in network flows in China, into China and out of China. Everything is compressed into 2 entry points and then the networks go up. That is really a model that if all countries did that, would be in a very, very, very uncyber reality. Very fragmented, if you wish.
Thank you, Natalie. Prime Minister.
I like very much this comparison between money and data. And people are also making rather similar evaluations what kind of risks they can take. And we are different. Some people want to, they accept high risk, but they want to have a high return as well. Some others want to have minimal risk and they don't care about the return. And I think we have to understand this, that data protection is not one single system, but it must take into the consideration different individual interests. Some people want to have high protection, some others are accepting lower level of protection. And secondly, my second comment is about trust. Money is totally based on trust. The value of money is artificial. It's based on trust, that we trust that it has the value. The same with data as well. Trust is a very critical component. What has happened, at least in Finland in recent weeks, it's very interesting. People have started to trust in public authorities much, much more than before. So the balance between individual freedom and role of the government, that balance has changed. And I think it's a good thing, in spite of the fact that we have to accept the fact that sometimes governments are misusing that trust as well. But in democratic societies, that risk is controlled, a controlled risk.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tom, President Turk, do you have thoughts that you want to add?
Well, I'm not a privacy expert, so I'm sitting here listening and learning for the most part. But it does strike me when we think about the social contract, and yes, there are tensions as you look across societies about what a social contract would look like. But I think we have to remember that a social contract is aspirational. It's and that's its role. It's an idea. It's a concept. If anything, it's pre-constitutional. And I think the value of a social contract for the digital age is it can help guide people to make these kinds of judgments. And they're going to differ as you work across different societies with different interests, different cultures, different values, and the like. But I think to put the marker down is a really useful thing to do. But I think you have to be mindful in crafting such a contract that you do have these differences. And so you can't kind of tailor a narrowly Western version of a social contract and expect it to go very far. I think it has to be very mindful. And I think that fits with what we have in the digital age, where these national boundaries don't mean as much as they did at one time.
Tom, what you're saying is important. I'm wondering, is it possible at the same time that we may be conflating culture with ethics that might be universal and human rights, although of course that's very provocative, and some places or governments would say, well, that itself is a provincial notion. But it seems that one of the barriers that one's going to run up against that we're already seeing is some countries or governments just say, that stuff is not for us. That's moral relativism. Is there a way to transcend that and to be able to reach or protect people who find themselves in circumstances where they are not protected, and yet because it's within a state or nation, really there's very little apparently that the international community seems to be able to do. Maybe this goes back to the president and prime minister, so that we don't get too hopeless. But Tom, what do you think about that? The cultural versus universal humanistic ethical notion.
No. If you think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now they're not respected by all societies, but again, in the aspirational sense, can we come to basic principles that should protect the rights and interests of individuals in the digital age? Put down those markers. And it doesn't mean that every government is going to be responsive to those principles, but there will be interests in every society that will be responsive to it and will find uses for it. So, I see real value in that kind of document. And I think it's one of the most important things that Club de Madrid and the Boston Global Forum can be working on.
So, yes.
One comment, since I do a fair amount with Chinese people and people in the Far East, is that they have a very different view about the social contract, where the common good counts for a lot more than the individual good. And I think it is cultural. I think it goes back thousands of years in their experience. And so there's like this control knob between different countries about the independence versus the common good.
Yeah, it's really important points. I guess the question is whether we can somehow transcend that dichotomy as well. President Tur, you're on mute.
Okay, well, now I'm guess. All right, look, Universal Declaration of Human Rights was mentioned a short while ago. And there is an article in the Universal Declaration, Article 28, which says every human person is entitled to a social and international order in which all his human rights can be fully realized. Can you imagine anything more ambitious than that? It was, of course, the state of the time in 1948, shortly after World War II, where the aspirations were high and the complexity of human rights was captured in a fairly systematic fashion and has influenced much of what has happened afterwards. Now, nobody believed that this is a legal enactment which can be put into force directly and applied by courts of law, and everybody will work exactly to a prescription. It was an aspirational document to a very large extent. So I think that the talk about social contract, which is in fact a philosophical concept, and which has to be translated into constitutional systems, and through constitutional systems in law, it's very much worthwhile discussing and figuring out the direction and perhaps instruments. I spoke earlier on about criminal law as an important instrument, which is largely neglected so far, but it should be put, into the discussion very directly. This has to do with the question of trust. Individual trusts their government if the government is fair and if it is just. So again, we come very close to the notion of law and legal enactment and criminal law aspect and so on. On trust, the interesting thing is this. We have now a very good time, and I agree with Prime Minister Aho about the importance of trust in this particular COVID-19 crisis. I mean, we have seen this in my country, in Slovenia, that trust has gone up when it comes to medical system, and health system has gained enormously in trust. And public media, public TV, public radio, media that try to look at the whole picture. So trust is, is a dynamic concept, if I may put it this way, and it would be worthwhile looking into how it evolves. I mean, I don't know about the United States. From what I see on CNN, I see a rather nervous situation relating to the whole question of trust in public authority. And finally, I think that it is important to keep privacy in the center of our discussion on social contract, because privacy is about human agency. And obviously, if we think seriously about a human person being able to manage, to govern technology, then of course human agency is the key. And which are the instruments that strengthen human agency? That is something to be developed further. Of course, it will not apply to all countries in the same way. But coming back to the beginning of my current remarks, having spent years in UN discussions on human rights, obviously there have always been differences of systems, differences of understanding, there were denials of human rights, but the discussion itself was helpful and healthy. And that is what we need here. We cannot prescribe the outcomes as yet, but I think we have to strengthen the discussion in order to help right kind of outcomes to happen.
Yeah, these points are really fundamental. With regard to trust, the issue of disinformation, of course, purposefully promulgated is very concerning. And that's something that we need to build more protections against as well. Prime Minister Aho, you get the last word. Please share some thoughts, and then we'll have a brief couple of questions.
I want to be a bit provocative, but if you compare American way of thinking about protection of individuals, and European, and especially Northern European way of thinking, I think there is rather big difference. In the US Constitution, citizens are protected against the government. In government is needed to protect people. So the whole idea is completely different. So I think we have to understand that there are different interpretations, and we have to live with them. I think trade is a good example that we can do that. Look at the global trade. In spite of the fact that economic systems are different, economic values are different, valuations are different. In spite of that fact, we have been able to create a trade system which is global. There are rather simple global rules for that. We have also ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, which is developing all the time rules and regulations for trade, which are not UN-based or globally somewhere approved, but they are more or less like ecosystem rules. How this ecosystem works. I think we need something similar, not top-down orders, not top-down rules, but some common principles according to which our ecosystem will be created. That's the target, in my opinion, in this new social contract.
So that's a wonderful way to sort of bring to a close these initial discussions and deliberations, or really sharing of thoughts. And it's a very hopeful one, because we are having the dialogue, and what's the role that we can play as Club de Madrid, Boston Global Forum, and the like, along with rules and regulations and all of these other entities, in what has to be a multilateral solution or set of solutions to this. I'm now going to just briefly go over to a couple of questions. And Maria Elena, please tell me if there are additional questions that I'm not seeing.
Yes, Prime Minister Lagunja is here with us. So Please, Prime Minister Lagondia, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it was really great listening to you guys. I mean, and it was really fascinating. I mean, how every time we open the questions again and again that we haven't thought about, which leads me to the conclusion that I think we are now, I see we are much more now in a race against the time. So my question would be very simple: how we can speed up, not so much the principles, discussion about the principles, because we are about there. We think we can agree to a certain extent about it, but how to speed up the issue of having some kind of actions, organizational structures, how to put all those stakeholders together, and do we need some kind of new mechanisms for the new normal? Because today I was just I saw the article in Science now in Nature Medicine that the King's College announced that together with Massachusetts General Hospital and some health science company, they developed artificial intelligence diagnostic that can predict whether someone is likely to have COVID-19 based on their symptoms, and so on and so on. So the life goes on. I mean, the people are producing something very clearly about what we are talking about. At the same time, I think that at least my experience is when people are confronted with a dilemma, what they have to give up, privacy or security, they will give up privacy. So we should not end in a time that we will have that dilemma, that we are making choice between privacy and security. And having said so, I think that it is very important that we somehow talk, because you mentioned rightly UN Convention of Human Rights. It looks like we need some kind of new digital Bill of Rights, and all stakeholders that we are talking about, that we are being together, should see how we can get to that, having in mind that then after having that, we have to see what are the mechanisms of implementing that, what we do. So just to end with this, I think that we have to see, because multilateralism is now on re-engineering itself, reimagining, reinventing itself. We have to see how we can, I'm just out of blue putting the comparison between International Agency for Atomic Energy and maybe something that could be dealing with what we are talking about, International Agency for Artificial Intelligence. I'm not saying that that's the solution. I'm just picking your brain to see how we can start making the structure that will be working on the principles, having in mind that creating the culture. And I see the benefit of what we're talking about in actually plowing, not the sea, but plowing the fertile ground in changing the culture that we need in a new normal.
So this is a really important point about the principles and the culture on the one hand, and we're going to talk further in our policy dialogue in September about social contract, about Bill of Rights, where the two may meet, etc. And then importantly, Prime Minister, as you're saying, what are the mechanisms? What are the actionables? And I think we've heard some of them today from our speakers. Does anybody want to speak to that a bit further in terms of next steps to accelerate particular mechanisms or structures or infrastructures that may be able to enable this? Nazli? You're on mute.
Can somebody unmute me, please? We have foundation. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, we have foundations, institutional foundations to operate as such mechanisms. But what is required is the linkages among them to develop common views and common operations. For example, the Internet Society has representation in almost all countries of the world. I can imagine some kind of a coupling with several international agencies, several businesses, and maybe even the ITUs to just to provide a foundation of what mechanisms could look like. We're not starting from scratch, but I think the idea of thinking about the mechanisms is excellent.
Alex, did you have a point about the mechanisms or implementation?
Just to follow up on Prime Minister Aho's comment about the Chamber of Commerce, or Nazli's about the internet things. one of the things you need to do, think of these as lots of little experiments in different nations, different areas. You need to know how the experiments worked out. So there needs to be standards and protocols for data sharing in order to sort of figure out what policies are working, which aren't, and moving forward. And that, I think, is really key to make it a learning organization as opposed to a frozen organization.
Yeah. Maria Elena, do we have additional questions before we close?
Yes, we have Prime Minister Pritkaps who is going to do a question. He is a Club de Madrid member. Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers. But I felt like in real life between permanent hope and despair. We still practically don't see way out of crisis. We see principles, we see need, and we see a veil of ignorance. Behind this veil of ignorance, I suppose moral hazards, economic problems, and all these unexpected ignorance of law and legislation is hidden. And because we should answer one question, which was asked by Chancellor of Austria: what is more important, saving life or privacy, if we are concentrated on privacy? But it is linked with other moral hazards as well. Without any doubt, all governments, and even mostly all people, almost all people, gives priority to saving life. That's understandable. And what that is beginning of pandemic. We don't know anything about end. I have suspicions that at the end of COVID-19, I hope there will be end, and as sooner as better. But at the end, we will have planet-covered network, because these networks are, we needed them. Networks will not be so much decentralized, privacy protecting, proximity tracing networks. There is certainly need to much more to develop these anonymous offline trackings. But at the end, we will have not only such kind. Then my question is, there will be unbelievable amount of data, which will cost billions, and which is really worth of billions, which could be used for economy, for culture, for politics, everywhere. How will be that possible to regulate that?
Yeah, so mindful of the time, I'm just going to draw on your question, Prime Minister, to say that, certainly in the United States, we also see this dichotomy, false dichotomy being presented between people's health and safety and the economy, which should not be a dichotomy. And we see willful ignorance, if you will, or lack of belief or political manipulation of science and facts. And these are things also that we have to wrestle with and make sure that in the digital age, they don't get magnified as opposed to diminished. Because of the time, I want to be respectful of that and everyone's time. I want to thank our speakers I want to thank our hosts and turn it back over to our hosts to finish out this, this roundtable. Maria Elena?
Well, I'll step in. This is Maria Elena. David, all through you. This is Maria Elena, and I want to thank everybody. I am very, very sorry because I assume I'm not in control of the questions, but I assume that there are many questions that are out there and that we have not been able to address in the discussion. And I would just hope that we can bring them all together and address them in the next iteration of our discussions. Now, hold on for a second, because there are two questions that I would really like to have, if we can, well, infringe on your time just a little bit longer. But there are two questions that we would really like to address if we can. Maria Romero, you have these. Can you please present them? And I ask you to bear.
Yes, Ruth Diamin, Club de Madrid advisor, is here also with us and would like to do a question to the panelists. Please, Ruth.
Yes. Well, thanks to all the panel. It was very interesting. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Okay. And my question was for Nasil, but maybe there are other person who want to answer, because she spoke about new standards in the international system and a new social contract. And I was asking if this means that power will not be the rule of the game. Is it clear?
Yeah. Shall I go ahead? Power is always the rule of the game, as far as I can understand it, but it is shaping and framing and developing constraints and responsibilities on how it is exercised. We have some now, but we don't have enough. And we are able to move away from hierarchy, but we have to build in a more detailed and more effective way of deploying and constraining power.
Okay, Maria, please.
Yes.
You have your question,
Yes.
but
Jerry,
I don't know if any of the other speakers or participants want to refer to this question, or should we move on to the next one?
So we just have Jerry Jones. Jerry, are you around? Could you put your camera on? Hello, Jerry. Okay, Jerry is not here. So President Frei Berga. Hello.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this initial discussion. Thank you to all our partners and colleagues. I would like to introduce an element that I would beg you to consider for our full meeting, and that is including the questions concerning employment and the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. We know that artificial intelligence most definitely is correlated with a certain degree of job loss. And the more sophisticated it gets, the more jobs are getting threatened. COVID obviously has left tens of thousands without the means of subsistence and really at the mercy of the charity of their governments. So I think to my mind, it would be helpful if we did address that question as well, the impact of both COVID and of the progress in AI on our economic future and on the dignity of citizens and their ability, you might say, their right to have employment.
Yeah, this really poses a huge hazard. A not unrelated issue, which is my field, but I won't get into it, is the mental health sequelae or consequences of all of this, which are going to be enormous. And with regard to the economy and the loss of jobs and all of the things that follow from that, of course, this creates a potentially unstable or difficult situation. It also creates the opportunity or catalyst for a large-scale change in interventions, as was described. Do any of the speakers want to address this? President Kirk?
President Kirk.
Yeah, very briefly. I think that both of these questions are really very valid and should be put in the list of questions for preparation of the main discussion later on. Just very briefly, the question of power should somehow be linked to this idea of crisis being a catalyst. And that, of course, has to do with power within countries, but also globally, because the crisis is likely to have a catalytic effect on the power relations, on geopolitics and other things. So this has to be somehow in the, this has to be somehow perceived. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we should go really deeply into this, but it's an important part of the reality we have to understand, at least to the minimum extent. And second, about employment, I mean, according to the latest ILO data, the expectation is that the current level of crisis is already producing 350 million cases of joblessness globally. So it's going to be a huge problem. It has to do with technology. And of course, I agree with the way, Chairman, you have dealt with this. This should be in the picture.
So, this also gets into the issue of the value of personal data as well, and maybe which has never been with the individual and is being monetized in different ways. So maybe there's some solution in there about getting money back to the people, by virtue or within this digital context. Maria Elena, are there any other questions that you want to address?
Yes, please. Just last question for Jerry Jones, Club Democrat Advisor. Thank you, Jerry. Your turn. I give you the floor.
Thank you, and good morning. An absolutely wonderful and outstanding discussion this morning. I've been in private industry for over the last 20 years, working in companies that deal in vast amounts of data about individuals. Our businesses have been primarily helping other companies being able to market their products and services to their customers and prospects. And as such, I have been standing many, many times at the intersection of culture, ethics, and law. As recently as last night, involved in a conversation with my colleagues from around the world on a new product and which law will apply. And one of the things that has become very apparent as we have moved from a physical world to a digital world, the pace of change has continued to accelerate. We all know that technology runs much faster than the law does. But in the last 20 years, it has run substantially faster, and we find ourselves faced with situations where technology allows lots of different things to be done without a framework of governmental boundaries that is already in place. And we find ourselves in situations where governments are starting to have to look backwards in order to try to predict what technology will be able to do. In the current context of the COVID pandemic, and there will be other pandemics and there will be other crises that confront humanity over time, it is very important for governments as the ultimate rule makers to be able to set the boundaries for private industry to be able to operate in, so that the benefits of private industry can be brought to bear effectively with a high degree of trust, as well as the proper accountability mechanisms around those businesses so that we operate within those boundaries. So my question is very fundamental, and it goes to the structure of the way that democracies work. We have got to find ways to pick up the pace and to adopt the frameworking of the boundaries for which society can operate, so that we can better properly balance the rights and responsibilities of people, society at large, businesses, and governments, and have a more level playing field but at the same time allowing governments, individuals, society, and business to be able to continue to think with data.
Yes. Nasli?
I think I'm uncomfortable about saying the following, but let me say it anyway. Countries differ on the extent to which they listen to, governments differ, listen to different segments of the private sector and not. And in some countries, the United States, for example, the lobbying mechanisms are so sophisticated that these have to be kind of marshaled or reframed or whatever. But the advantage is that we know where some re-engineering must be done to get closer to what you're suggesting. For other countries, I don't know what would that be, but they are there. They're at their interface. It's just a question of doing the exploration and finding them.
Prime Minister.
One comment from Europe. I just discussed today with representatives of the government of Finland, and they have analyzed carefully how this European data protection regulation, GDPR system, how is it working with these technological requirements or these requirements to protect us with the best digital solutions today? And the answer is that actually there is no contradiction. The system works. And according to the existing rules, you can collect data in a way which makes it possible that we can start using that in an efficient way to protect people. So I think, Jerry, this European data protection system is a good example of rules for the game. I'm not trying to say that it's perfect, but I understand that it's anyway one attempt to create some kind of common ground for all.
Alex.
So I was involved in the early days of GDPR, and the observation is that it's working as you just said, but there's these boundary conditions. And to support of what Jerry Jones said, there are areas where it's very clear what to do, and governments should make those clear, right? So for instance, aggregate and anonymous data is necessary for sustainable development for lots of government operations. Things that fall in these very clear categories, governments should make very clear statements about, which will promote data use to move over to the cases where it's possible to do it today directly, clearly, because some of the edge cases will take forever to sort out. And as Nasli and people were saying, it'll be very different in some countries. But there's many that are just broadly accepted. And what's lacking is governments are always sort of a little resistant to even make a declaration about the clear areas.
Yeah, so it seems like the fall policy dialogue will be helpful. It almost seems like it's would be too long to wait for the fall, given everything that needs to be done in the accelerated time scale. Although what's nice is that the Club de Madrid and Boston Global Forum will continue to work together between now and then, and that there is a consensus, certainly that has emerged here today, around the need for a clear global multilateral declaration of principles, and then an accelerated, effective way to implement this and to bring people on board. And I guess it's all of our hope that that by working together with other entities, and despite the complexities or perhaps being cognizant of them, we can make demonstrable progress on that front. So Maria Elena, do you or our hosts want to say any final words? I certainly want to thank our speakers who have brought tremendous light to bear on the issues and the problems and potential solutions.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to all of the speakers and the participants. And bear with me, I don't have an image, otherwise the line would have problems. But I'd like to thank all of you. Definitely, David, September will be too long it'll be too long to wait until September to continue this conversation. So plans are underway to have another session in the coming months, in the coming weeks, maybe even in the coming weeks. And this discussion has only given us a hint of the importance and the depth of the relationship, the synergies that exist between artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and democratic governance, and the importance that all of this will have on the reinvigoration of a multilateral system that I am sure we are all convinced we need. We need that reinvigoration of the system, and we have to make sure that we contribute to making technologies and artificial intelligence part of the solution and not part of the problem in this equation. So we look forward, we thank you again, we look forward to continued discussions, and as we prepare for September and for October and our annual policy dialogue on multilateralism that delivers. Thank you all very, very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Wonderful.